What is the perception inside South Korea? Because in the United States, there was a lot of drumbeats of we should be terrified of North Korea, and they could shoot a missile against, hit Hawaii or Guam or San Francisco or anything like that. And what I'm curious about is, and particularly to the best extent you could read a South Korean perspective, is really to distinguish, things get very conflated, obviously, in our press coverage, and you've done a great job of distinguishing this. That, as an example, of course, there's brutal human rights violations in North Korea. Of course, there's an authoritarian structure. That is absolutely not a one-to-one to them being any type of real external threat, certainly in the United States. I mean, South Korea is different, obviously. And that third, regardless of what you think of the nature of the government, it doesn't mean that they don't have their own valid national security concerns and their own sense of U.S. Presence, essentially. So what is the actual security situation there? If you were going to look at it just sort of from a realist perspective of the North Koreans, and then in South Korea, where there is actually the threat. I mean, if something went off, we wouldn't pay the consequence in the United States. South Korea and obviously North Koreans would. It seems like this agenda he has of engagement and diplomacy is pretty popular, at least at the moment.
Well, his popularity right now is about 70% in recent polls. And a lot of that has to do with, COVID-19 and how the government has handled that. But people also support by a majority. There's been polls taken on specifically on his North Korea policies, and about 60% support this engagement. And people there are they're used to confrontational atmosphere with North Korea. It's been happening for years and years. When I was living there in 2017, at the height of the sort of missile scare when the DPRK was testing these ICBMs and tensions really rose with the U.S., people where I was in Gwangju were far more worried about, Trump doing something stupid and launching a unilateral attack or something like that. They weren't concerned that North Korea was going to invade or attack them. And also a lot of people there understand that, for one thing, South Korea's military is about 7 times bigger than North Korea. And they spend about 7 times more than North Korea does on military. So they have a huge military force in South Korea. I wrote a piece for The Nation a few months ago, talking about this large military buildup by the South Korean military, as well as the U.S. and Japan. And so North Korea sees itself surrounded, by a very vast military power jointly run by the U.S. in alliance with South Korea and Japan. And, the U.S. forces in Asia Pacific include, aircraft carriers that carry nuclear weapons, planes that carry nuclear weapons based in Guam and so on. So, the North Koreans and, a lot of hardline analysts here in the United States understand that they built their nuclear weapons capability to protect themselves from another attack from the United States. And they looked at, what happened in Iraq. The U.S. invaded Iraq. The U.S. NATO overthrew a government in Libya that had already, denuclearized. And they said, well, we're not going to be invaded like that and taken over. So I think, the U.S., I keep saying this over and over again, the United States is not a neutral player, is not an innocent bystander in Korea. During the Korean War, U.S. Air Force completely destroyed North Korea with bombing, firebombing, napalm. 3 million or more civilians were killed. It was an unbelievable, terrible, terrible war. And people in North Korea, of course, never forget that. People in South Korea don't forget that. And nobody wants a war. And I think, one of the issues that happened with Moon Jae-in, a kind of a turning point in the peace process there, was in 2017, around August 2017 or so, there was, a lot of thinking going on here in Washington of a U.S. unilateral attack on North Korea. And, Moon Jae-in made it very clear that there cannot be any kind of unilateral attack like that, because any kind of war would, of course, envelop South Korea, and you could have millions killed within hours. You have all this, artillery, North Korean artillery just north of Seoul. And, it would be a terrible thing. And so, he made some very public statements and, made sure that did not happen. And that was a big reason that Trump actually began talking with the North. So it's still a difficult situation, but I think that Moon has the right idea, that you engage and slowly, move toward, peacemaking steps, take steps, gradual steps toward a peace. Denuclearization should be the final step in the peace process. You build trust, and then you through these projects, you build more trust. And then over time, then you can de-escalate the military situation. It's a process. Right. And people in the United States have to recognize that, yes, you may hate their government, the North Korean government, you may despise their dictator, but they have a right to exist. There's people there. There's 30 million people in North Korea who have the same kind of wants and needs that most human beings have. And one of them is not to have a war and not to be destroyed in a war. And so I think there's a real tendency in America, especially even many liberals.
Oh yeah, they were freaking out about Trump talking to him, and it was I couldn't believe the pretzels that the idea that let them engage with each other. If Trump
to talk to,
he's
their leader. Right?
Bizarre. I don't, and this idea that you're rewarding him. I don't know what the alternative is. I was flummoxed by that, but maybe I'm simple-minded. I could.
Well, no, it's a valid concern, because as I and others point out a lot. The U.S. after all was allied with USSR under Stalin. Franklin Roosevelt, met with Stalin, and we were allies at that time. Stalin was almost the definition of a dictator, right? So, but he was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. And so, that's
you have to do business. What is in the last couple of minutes, what is the relationship between Moon Jae-in and China? And how does the China dimension play in all this?
Well, actually, they actually have pretty good relations with China, and I think actually, the other day, Xi Jinping and Moon agreed. Xi said he's going to wants to visit South Korea sometime this year. They've had a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions. There's a huge amount of trade between South Korea and China. And they've been economic partners, for many years, and so relations can be pretty tense. They got pretty tense, when South Korea allowed or gave permission to the U.S. to build these THAAD anti-missile batteries that were very unpopular in South Korea, but because of the radar in those THAAD system, many people in the government of China thought that was also directed at them. It was not only aimed at stopping North Korean missiles, but it was a kind of escalation with tensions with China, and so they Chinese boycotted South Korean products and so on. But that's kind of ebbed. But because of China's close relationship with North Korea. They've been allies for a long time. There's no Chinese troops or anything like that in the North, like there are U.S. troops in the South. But so South Korea, has to maintain those kinds of relationships. And I think there's a lot of movement in Asia and Northeast Asia toward more integration of economies, and there's a lot of plans on the drawing boards in China and South Korea as well. for all kinds of projects to more integrate those countries. So it's in their interest to, that's a very big push. But that's one of the reasons for Moon having maintaining good relationships with the Chinese leadership.
Tim Shorrock, really appreciate your time as always. Everybody read Tim, his reporting in The Nation. It's nice to have a leader and a government to be impressed with right now. And it's also very, very important that you read beyond the cliches when you're reading about Korea. So, Tim, thanks so much for all the work you do.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. All right, folks.